Knives, machetes, saws, and shears, multi-tools, shovels, swords, axes, spears, hatchets, and tomahawks. If it cuts, snips, slices, or chops, Midway USA has it. Find great gift ideas in our huge selection of pocket knives and other everyday carry folding knives. Make a statement or create a family legacy with one of our top-of-the-line hunting knives. We've got a great selection of manual and electric sharpeners too. For just about everything for the outdoors, check out midwayusa.com.
Fishing like a local isn't just about catching fish. It's about connecting with the environment and the people who call it home. It's about hearing the stories and traditions that have been passed down for generations and sharing unforgettable moments with the people you meet along the way. Fishing like a local is having an experience that stays with you forever. And with Fishing Booker, you can experience it too, no matter where you are. Discover your next adventure on Fishing Booker.
Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. Well, we're returning to an episode style that we have not seen in a long time here at Casting Across, and that is a Why You Should Go episode. And essentially what it is a complete primer on heading to some part of the country for the fly fishing that it may bring you. And over the course of the few years that I've been doing the podcast, I've talked about specific streams and rivers and lakes, and I've talked also about states and regions of the country. And today that is what I'm going to be doing as well, because I'm talking about my backyard. Actually, to be more accurate, it's kind of like my down the street, and that is the New England coastline. Now, there are so much that can be said about fly fishing the New England coastline, because there are opportunities in the estuaries, there is the coast proper, and then there is offshore. And this brings about an entire realm of possibilities, things that go well beyond my expertise and probably most people's expertise. Those folks that really know how to probe the deep water 100 miles off the coast, and those people that know how to get into those back channels to find the fish that lurk up in the swamps probably could learn a lot from each other. And that's kind of the situation when it comes to saltwater fishing in general, that there's a great diversity. Saltwater fishing, sometimes we think of it's just big open blue water. Well, when you think about freshwater fishing, think about the diversity that you find within just that. I mean, there's a difference between a bass angler and a small stream trout fisher. And even within trout fishing, the difference between a big tailwater angler and the person who likes to chase blue lines, although there is a lot of crossover, there is two very different spheres of expertise and understanding, even down to things like gear, technique, jargon, and so on and so forth. And so saltwater is no different than that. So again, I know that the majority of my audience is probably a freshwater, trout-focused crowd, and so I like to throw those disclaimers out there. I also want to say I'm not the expert when it comes to saltwater. I'd actually say it's kind of like my lowest stave. If you think of like the Casting Across knowledge barrel has the lowest stave when it comes to fly fishing is saltwater fly fishing. I do it. I do pretty well at it. I certainly enjoy it, and I've been doing a lot more of it as I've lived closer to the coast in these last few years. But it's definitely not in the same part of my wheelhouse as you would find trout fishing and smallmouth bass fishing and a lot of other things that you see me write about and hear me talk about a lot. But all that to say, New England is an incredibly wonderful place to live, but also visit. And one of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is that fly fishing the New England coast is because I know a lot of people vacation up here. I know that because I sit in the traffic and I see all the license plates. And whether you are from Florida or California or anywhere in between, you've been here. I've seen you. I've sat behind you going 40 miles an hour. But that is a great thing because there is a lot of opportunity across the New England states. And so Vermont, and not to spoil a story, but there's no coastline in Vermont. Vermont and New Hampshire, Maine, and then Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Those are all New England states. Sorry, New York, you are not New England. But the majority of the New England states, so you have Maine and then New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut all have coastline. And with the exception of New Hampshire, which only has about 18 miles formally of coastline, uh, every other state has a lot. Even little Rhode Island has a lot of coastline. But just contemplate this. Maine has 228 miles. I'm looking at the stats here. If you were to draw a line. But when you include all the inlets, bays, islands, river mouths, things like that, there is almost 3,500 miles of coastline. 3,500 miles of coastline. And so consider just fly fishing or fishing in general. What is one of the points in which you like to focus when you're pursuing fish? It is the edge. Why do we fish the edges? Well, there's a number of reasons why we fish the edge. There's structure, there is movement, there is cover for bait fish, and there are opportunities for other things to hide and also to ambush. And so think about that in Maine. You have effectively 3,500 miles of that kind of fishing opportunity. Massachusetts, much, much smaller, but because of the Cape and because of just the geology and hydrology of this area, has over 1,500 miles of coastline. And we could give those stats all the way down to Connecticut and Rhode Island as well. But there is just an absolute abundance of opportunity. Now, that opportunity presents itself in a number of ways. You might think of kind of that prototypical New England coast where, like, if you've been to Acadia up in Maine, and it's big, steep, craggy, rocky coastlines. And there is a lot of that around. And that is very, very difficult to access by foot. But there are a lot of places on the coast that are sandy or are rocky, but are a nice, smooth surface. And it's interesting, and it's one of the good things about it is that although you have some of those steep, rocky shorelines, they are oftentimes abutted directly upstream or downstream. My freshwater showing, right, to the up the coast or down the coast by something that you can wade out into. And so, if you want to take advantage of those waves crashing bait fish up against the rocks, then you can wade safely somewhere relatively close to that and bomb out a long cast and be able to take advantage of those fishing opportunities. And so, although you're not going to wade out into the big, steep, rocky cliff, you can wade out relatively close to it and catch fish that are heading in that direction or coming from that direction. So you can definitely walk and wade. There's a lot of great access. There are public lands all over the place, up and down the coastline. I have caught striper in the lights of Boston. I've caught them on national refuges in the North Shore of Massachusetts. I've caught fish in Maine and in New Hampshire, just close to public beaches. There are so many places where you can access these fish. And again, if this is something that you are doing kind of in conjunction with a family vacation, this ought to be very encouraging. There are fish virtually everywhere. Now, there's a seasonality to that, and we'll talk about that here in a moment, but you can probably catch fish as long as they are there if you can get to the saltwater. So you can definitely do it on foot. Now, if you have access to a kayak and you feel skilled enough to head into saltwater in a kayak, then that is really where the opportunities completely explode, because we're not talking about paddling out into the deep blue ocean, but with all of the rivers, river mouths, and estuaries, there are so many options that are available to you. Now, again, I want to throw the huge caveat out there that you need to be aware of tides. And if you are a freshwater angler and you don't have to worry about tides as you go about your normal fly fishing, this is something that you need to be reasonably acquainted with. It isn't necessarily that you are going to get stuck somewhere or that you're going to get swept out to sea, although that is a legitimate concern. It really has to do more with the idea of energy and effort. If you paddle in with the tide and then turn around as the tide continues to rise, then you're going to have a big, big challenge on your hands, or vice versa. Just something to be aware of. But if you rent a canoe or you have access to a canoe or a kayak and you can hop into one of those estuaries and just paddle around, then it's going to feel a lot more like the freshwater fishing that you're used to, especially if you're chasing something like stripers, where you're going to get into these spots and it's basically just like bass fishing. Now, that is a gross overgeneralization when you get down to the nitty-gritty, but when it comes to your general approach, it's going to be something that is much more familiar to the freshwater angler, or if you're fishing those rivers, that's going to be much more familiar to the freshwater angler than maybe fishing up and down the coastline and the shore itself. So you can access a lot of places on foot. You can access a lot more places if you have access to a small craft. And lastly, and again, this is not something to rule out, but if you get a guide, they can take you to all of these places and then, certainly enjoy your fishing. Pay attention to what the guide is saying. Try to catch as many fish in the places that are only accessible by professionals guiding, but take mental notes of where they have you casting. I find virtually everywhere and every style of fishing that I've had guides take me to, I say, you know what, with a little bit of energy, a little bit of effort, and maybe moving around and manipulating myself a little bit, I can get to almost all these places. Only very rarely are there places that I find completely inaccessible to me on foot or in a kayak or a canoe that the guide can take me to. So that is the third thing. Again, now that does cost money, and generally speaking, a guide in the saltwater and a guide in New England is going to cost a little bit more than most other places that I've fished in the United States. But that doesn't mean that it is completely out of reach, and it certainly is something that's worth looking into. And that said, there's a lot of good guides and a lot of kind of old standbys and up and comers that are trying to make their name, that are really doing a good job of guiding folks and getting their name out there. So that's the first thing to think about. You can get to this water and you can get to these fish. If you're coming here for a family vacation, then definitely throw in that 7 or 8 or 9 weight rod. If you have a really heavy trout rod, like a 7 weight, then go for it. It's not going to be the best tool for it, but it'll work. If you have that 8 or 9 weight that you use for toothy fish or for smallies or for largemouth bass or for salmon or steelhead, then that is going to be an option that works really, really well. And again, if you're just dipping your toes in these water, then you don't need to have the bulletproof saltwater reel. If you have a good disc drag reel, it's going to work totally fine. And as far as fly line goes, I would say use whatever. If you have an intermediate line, that's probably going to be your best bet. Again, fishing poppers for things like stripers, it's super exciting, but that is kind of like the dry fly ratio almost. I mean, catch the majority of your fish on streamers, and every once in a while, you'll catch one on a popper. It kind of like the nymph and dry fly ratio again. Even things like crabs are going to be much more productive than poppers, and so a sinking or intermediate line is a great thing to have. But as is always the case, you can fish those patterns using a floating fly line. So your whatever 8 weight you have, whatever 9 weight you have, even a 7 or a 10, but 8 or 9 are kind of your standard fare. A 9-foot rod is about expected and normal. Whatever fly line you have on there will work, and then just a good selection of flies. Probably if you fish streamers for larger trout and bass, if they are things like clousers and deceivers, then you're golden. But of course, if you're going to be doing this, then talking to a local guide, talking to a local fly shop proprietor, finding those flies that are working really well in that area at that time, or just generally throughout the season, is not a bad thing to do. I think you could probably outfit yourself with $50 worth of flies, and only a handful of them, maybe like 6 or 8 of them, aren't going to work at home on things like smallmouth bass or muskie and things like that. So definitely checking with your local fly shop wherever you are fishing, you're going to find exactly what you need. And of course, tapping into those resources is going to be your best first step into success. So, you're listening to this. I'm giving you super general information that spans all the way from the tip of Maine, all the way down to Long Island Sound and in at the end of Connecticut. But in a very specific sense, you talk to those local fly shops, and again, you patronize them. You call ahead of time and say, "Hey, can you give me information? I'm looking forward to coming to your fly shop when I get there." And when you get there, you say, "Hey, thanks for giving me the information. I'd like to pick up a handful of flies or a couple of leaders or something like that." And you're doing exactly what you should be doing, and hopefully they'll be very, very eager to continue to help you as you are fishing in their backyard and in their water. So from a gear standpoint, that's generally what you're looking at. Again, I go back to 8 or 9 weight. I fish both of them. I like to have my 9 weight rigged up for my intermediate or my sinking line, and my 8 weight rigged up for my floating line for when I throw poppers. But if you only have one, both will work just fine. I've caught plenty of fish on 8 weights, plenty of fish on 9 weights from essentially the same places on the beach and in the estuaries. They both work really well, and they're both going to really still the fish are going to put up a fight. A decent sized striper, and even that, a schoolie striper is going to put up a good fight on both of those weights. And as I always, remind folks, feel free to use freshwater gear in the salt. Just rinse it, wash it. When you use saltwater gear in the salt, rinse it, wash it. Take care of your stuff. It'll take care of you. I know a lot of people think that their gear should be bulletproof. And the fact of the matter is that it usually is, but why take the risk? Especially if you're not going to be doing a lot of saltwater fishing. Why would you add that extra level of abuse to your gear that you're going to turn around and just take back to the freshwater? So just take it in the shower with you. If you have an outdoor shower where you're staying, bring the stuff in there and give it a nice good rinse, or take it inside into the shower, or bare minimum, hose it off really, really well. So let's get back to fishing in New England. A couple more logistical things. What are you looking at? Now, I'm going to give some very, very generic and general guidelines. You're probably going to see striped bass first, and they're going to show up probably end of May, depending on where you are in New England. And again, you can chart this. There's a handful of websites that show the migrating stripers up the East Coast, but maybe April, May is where you're going to start seeing stripers, and then you're going to see the bluefish come in the summertime, and they're both going to stick around till about November. Now, both the stripers and the bluefish are going to be accessible on foot. Now, if you have a little bit of a opportunity to get out further, whether it be in a watercraft or you're staying someplace where you're closer to deep water, then by the time you get to August, then you're probably going to have at least a shot at bonito and false albacore. And albies are just an incredible fish. That is where your gear may really, really be tested. The pull of one of those fish is completely different than even a good-sized striped bass. But that's generally the season that we're looking at. The best case scenario, early April, and then all the way to November. And so one of the cool things about October, November is that's the off season for all intents and purposes when you are talking about beach traffic and just folks coming for general tourism. Well, the coastline is still beautiful. There's still restaurants that are open. There's still things to do, and there are still fish that are there. The numbers do begin to dwindle, but they're still around because that water is freezing even in like June and July. My kids will swim in the ocean year round because they think they have nerve damage or something. But I mean, it is still very, very chilly. I don't think I've gotten in the ocean at all this year because I've only been a couple times in the last few weeks and it's just starting to get to a comfortable temperature. But you're able to get out and you're able to catch those fish. Again, primarily stripers and then bluefish. And then, like I said, you could get into albies and maybe bonito later in the year, depending on where you are. They're certainly much more accessible if you're kind of off, maybe on an island, maybe Martha's Vineyard, maybe Nantucket, something like that, or even at like Gloucester, into Provincetown, these kind of further out areas where you're able to potentially get into those fish. And, think about the places I just mentioned. If you know anything about Massachusetts, super touristy, Provincetown, Gloucester, the Vineyard, and Nantucket, but the fishing is phenomenal in every one of these locations. And that's kind of part of the quaint, rustic charm of these places that they were, before they were mansions of the lifestyles of the rich and famous, they were quaint little fishing villages. And the fish are, maybe not the same number, but they are still there, and they're worth pursuing. So that's definitely worth checking out. Now, another thing that is worth mentioning is it's very affordable to fish. So if you are, say, traveling up and down New England, you're maybe spending a little time in Boston, a little bit time up in Acadia, you are out $10 effectively to fish in those states. And there's reciprocity between New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maine. So if you have a Massachusetts saltwater recreational fishing permit, which is $10, if you're under 60. If you're over 60, it's free. You get it online, just like you do for any other fishing license. And with that Massachusetts license, you can fish saltwater in New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maine. $10, which is great. Now, given you probably spend a lot of money on flies, and if you get a guide or something like that, that's a lot of money, but it's one less thing to worry about and think about. And for me, being a resident, it's fantastic to know that I can fish anywhere in the salt around here, and all I need is one little permit. It's a great way to experience really a diverse ecosystem, even though, like, say I'm in the middle of New Hampshire. I'm 10 miles up the coast, I'm in Maine, 10 miles down the coast, I'm in Massachusetts, but there truly is a difference. There's, sandy beaches, there are rocky beaches, there are cliff beaches, there are river mouths that are gentle and meandering, and river mouths that have an obscene amount of water coming out of them. And it truly is a very, very diverse fishing experience going up and down the coastline of New England. And like I said, even just in this part where I am, the New Hampshire coast. So there are so many more things that could be said. But to kind of boil it down, one, definitely experience it. If you haven't tried it before, it's a great opportunity. Now, the stripers here aren't going to be as giant as they are, say, in like Montauk off of New York, or even necessarily further down towards the mid-Atlantic, but they are plentiful. And there is something special about the fact that you can walk out and wade here. It isn't super muddy. It isn't super swampy. It is very accessible. And a lot of times you are right off the coast of a relatively populated area, a quaint New England town. It's a very cool fishing opportunity. It also is great because you're able to, for that very same reason, link it up with that Boston trip or that Providence trip or that work trip to all of those tiny little towns on the 95 corridor in Connecticut. Or as your family is spending a week up in down east Maine or something like that, you're able to go and step out in the water, make a handful of casts in the morning, a handful of casts in the evening, and you never know what you're going to hook into. You can have a lot of fun with schoolie stripers, and you may very well hook into a very, very large fish. And that is one of the exciting things about fishing around here. So there are so many more resources that are out there. I'll actually recommend a book here at the end of the podcast that will give you more information than you will ever need when it comes to fly fishing the New England coast. But definitely hop online. If you go to a fly fishing show, there's almost always a handful of New England guides, and they can give you all the information that you need about what it takes to fly fish, both from a skills standpoint and from a booking standpoint, like when to get there and where to stay. And they're happy to give information. A really, really good group of people that I'm happy that I've become familiar with over the last handful of years. Well, this week on Casting Across, the first article that came out on Monday was called Rusty Flybox, Me, the Fly Fisherman. It was my birthday, and so I didn't feel like spending too much time writing, but I pulled out 3 articles from the archives that I think are really good. The first one talks about kind of how I developed my love for nature. The second one is how I developed my love for fly fishing, and the third one is how I developed my love for casting across. So definitely check those out. These 3 articles have gotten a lot of eyeballs over the last few years. Some of them are relatively recent, some of them go back a handful of years, but I think they're really good pictures of me. I don't often write too autobiographically, that's the word. I try to make it a little bit more approachable and less about me, but these were 3 articles that talk a little bit about who I am, which of course is helpful. It gives you a little bit of a backstory when you listen to me or when you read Casting Across. Wednesday's article is called Life and Death in the Middle, a Review. So this is a quick little read, and it's about 160 pages, and it's, I think, split into like 58 chapters. So it's short, everything from a page to like 4 pages. And it's a great book, and I'll give you the very quick synopsis of why. It's well written, and it talks about things that are deeper than I caught a big fish. So if that interests you, and if you're listening to me and reading Casting Across, there's a very good chance that that's you, then definitely check out Life and Death in the Middle. And there's a link to where you can pick up that book over on that post, which appeared this Wednesday on Casting Across. This week's recommendation on the podcast is a book that is right now listed for $2,300 on Amazon, Well, you can get the Kindle for $9.99, and you can probably get it cheaper elsewhere as well. So I'm going to put the link for the Kindle edition for $9.99 on the bottom of the show notes for this podcast over at castingacross.com. But it's The Fly Fisher's Guide to the New England Coast. Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. So Connecticut, sorry, you are left out. And it's probably because of your bad traffic. But this is a 14-year-old book. However, it's still an excellent resource for getting generally acquainted with the area. It's going to give you more or less places and techniques that are going to still work today. And you use this in conjunction with the local fly shop, and you're going to be effectively set to get your feet wet and your fly wet in the New England coast. So again, I'll put a link for the Kindle edition, which is about $2,340 less than the used paperback, which, tell you what, I've got a paperback. I'll sell it to anyone for under $2,000. How about that? But definitely check out this book. It will give you enough information to get the ball rolling on getting out and chasing fish on the New England coast. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing podcast. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast app and then rate the podcast in iTunes and Spotify. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.
A life that has the stories to back it. A life to be proud of. It's a Winchester life.
Yeah, baby. 6'8" Western. Oh, mule deer, baby, right there.
Tune in every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern on Waypoint TV.